He had already been chosen as king. The crown was practically resting on his head before the Prophet arrived in Medina, forever changing his destiny. The elders of Medina had gathered around him. They were ready to crown him, and then everything he had planned collapsed in a single moment. No enemy ever harmed the early Muslim community from outside the way this one man poisoned it quietly from within for years. He prayed in the masjid, he walked among the believers, he spoke their language, yet his heart was the darkest room in all of Medina. What is it that a man hides so perfectly that even those closest to him cannot see the rot spreading beneath his smile every single day? Allah did not just expose him. Allah revealed an entire surah of the Quran that will carry his story until the last day arrives. Before we start, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments below. If you already done, let's begin the journey. Before the Prophet ever set foot in Medina, this ancient city carried a different name, a different soul, and a different destiny entirely. Long before Islam arrived, this land was called Yathrib, a place of date palms, flowing wells, deep tribal rivalries, and endless bloodshed between its people. Two great Arab tribes had dominated this land for countless generations, the Aws and the Khazraj, locked in a devastating war that exhausted everyone around them. The battles between these two tribes had continued for so long that even the eldest among them could no longer remember when the killing had first truly begun. Hundreds upon hundreds had been buried in that dry ancient soil because of tribal pride, old wounds, and an honor that cost far more than it was ever worth. By the time the dust of those long wars began to settle, the people of Yathrib desperately needed one strong voice to rise and finally unite their broken community. And there was one man, tall, commanding, eloquent, and politically sharp, whom both tribes had quietly begun to accept as their natural and undisputed future leader among them. He was not a young dreamer chasing empty ambitions. He was a seasoned, calculating man whose words carried enormous weight in every single gathering he ever entered. The people of Yathrib saw in him a rare combination of charisma and cunning that they believed could finally bring a lasting end to all their suffering and division. A crown was being prepared, not of gold, but of authority, loyalty, and power. And the tribal elders were already moving to place it upon his waiting head. He had spent his entire political life building toward this single defining moment, and every sign surrounding him confirmed that the moment had decisively and finally arrived for him. Then something happened that no tribal calculation, no political strategy, and no human ambition could have ever predicted or prepared any man to absorb and accept with grace. Word began traveling from the distant city of Makkah. Word of a man named Muhammad, a prophet carrying a message unlike anything the world had ever heard before. The early Muslims of Makkah had endured years of brutal torture, humiliating boycotts, and relentless persecution before Allah finally granted them permission to seek a new and blessed home. The leaders of Yathrib, from both the Aws and the Khazraj, had traveled secretly to Makkah and sat with the Prophet beneath the quiet cover of night. They had listened carefully to his words, felt something ancient and powerful shift deep within their chests, and returned home as believers carrying the first light of Islam with them. These early converts from Yathrib became known as the Ansar, the helpers, and their city would soon transform into the living heart of the entire Muslim world forever. In the year 622 CE, the Prophet made the blessed and historic migration from Makkah to Medina, and with that single journey, a magnificent new chapter of history began. The city received him with a joy so overwhelming, so pure, and so sincere that the very air of Medina seemed to vibrate with the weight of descending divine blessing. Children ran joyfully through the streets. Women sang from the rooftops with tears streaming down their faces, and the hearts of the believers swelled with an indescribable and sacred love. But standing somewhere within that celebrating crowd was a man whose face displayed joy, while his heart was quietly processing something cold, bitter, and deeply wounded inside him. For him, the arrival of the Prophet was not a mercy descending from the heavens. It was a throne being silently stolen from beneath him without a single battle fought. Everything he had spent long years carefully building, every relationship he had cultivated, every calculated step toward supremacy had been completely undone in a matter of just a few weeks. The people who had once looked to him with admiration now looked toward the Prophet with a total devotion that left absolutely no political space remaining for anyone else. He made a cold, deliberate, and deeply dangerous calculation that night. And the decision he reached would define his eternal legacy until the very last day of all existence. He would not fight the Prophet openly because he was far too intelligent to walk into a battle where every advantage was so completely and obviously against him already. Instead, he would remain close, appear loyal, perform the outward rituals of Islam, and work patiently and carefully from within the deepening shadows of the growing Muslim community. He became the first and most dangerous kind of enemy the Muslim community had ever truly faced. Not a raised sword from outside, but a practiced smile worn from within. The Prophet established the famous Constitution of Medina, uniting Muslims, Jews, and various tribes under one remarkable framework of shared rights, duties, and mutual protection for everyone living there. This new and unprecedented social order further stripped away whatever political relevance remained for those who performed Islam outwardly, while their hearts burned with rejection and resentment deep within. Among those who declared faith with their tongues, while their hearts remained in firm rejection, there was a growing and dangerous number of men gathering quietly around their calculating leader. Allah knew with absolute certainty what was hidden within every single chest in Medina, and his revelation would never allow spreading hypocrisy to remain permanently concealed from the believers. The Prophet began receiving verses about the hypocrites, precise warnings, chilling descriptions, and devastating exposures that cut through every carefully constructed mask with divine clarity and surgical precision. But even as those revelations descended, the man at the center of it all continued walking freely, speaking publicly and positioning himself as a respected senior figure within the community. He had loyal followers, considerable influence, and the deeply dangerous ability to plant seeds of doubt and division into hearts not yet strong enough in faith to resist him. The early Muslim community was still young, still fragile in certain ways, still learning what it truly meant to live together as one unified and divinely guided body of believers. And into that young, vulnerable and beautiful community, like slow poison carefully poured into a clean well, this man began his quiet and devastating work from deep within. The surah that Allah would one day reveal about him and those like him would become one of the most chilling documents of spiritual exposure ever preserved in all of human history. But to understand why Allah chose to dedicate an entire surah of his eternal and perfect book to this man, we must first understand exactly how deep the corruption had truly grown. The full picture of what this man did, what he whispered, and what he nearly destroyed within the young Muslim community has not yet been completely and honestly told to the world. What happened next, in the narrow streets of Medina, along the burning desert caravan routes, and inside the private gatherings of the believers, was about to shake everything to its very core. The city of Medina was growing every single day, not just in population, but in purpose, faith, and a unity that made its enemies deeply uncomfortable. Every morning the Prophet sat among his beloved companions, teaching them, refining them, and building a community unlike anything the world had ever witnessed or imagined before. The masjid stood at the center of it all, a simple structure of clay and palm trunks. Yet from within it came a revolution shaking every throne on earth. From that humble and blessed space, disputes were settled, revelations descended, and a divine light filled the air of Medina with something no ancient city had ever breathed before. But while the sincere believers gathered and built something sacred together, there were those who sat among them while secretly and patiently working to hollow it from the inside completely. The leader of the hypocrites attended these gatherings, sat within these sacred circles, and listened carefully, not to grow in faith, but to identify and map every weakness he observed. He watched how believers responded to hardship. He noted which hearts were firm and which were fragile, filing every single weakness away for a future moment he intended to exploit fully. The early battles of Islam placed enormous and relentless pressure upon the young Muslim community, and pressure has a terrifying way of revealing exactly what lies beneath every human surface. When the Battle of Badr arrived, the believers marched forward with almost nothing. No large army, no powerful weapons, and no worldly advantage of any meaningful or significant kind whatsoever. Yet Allah granted them a victory so stunning, so total, and so decisive that the entire Arabian Peninsula felt the trembling aftershock of what had happened at blessed Badr. The hypocrites watched this extraordinary victory in calculating silence, some with grudging disbelief, some with hidden fury, but none could afford to show anything other than outward congratulation. After Badr, something powerful shifted across Medina. More people entered Islam sincerely, the community grew visibly stronger, and the political irrelevance of the hypocrites became painfully and undeniably obvious. The leader of the hypocrites responded by tightening his grip on his followers, whispering more carefully, planting doubts more skillfully, and concealing his true hatred with even greater precision than before. Then came the Battle of Uhud, and this particular battle would hand the hypocrites their greatest single opportunity to wound the Muslim community from within in a devastating and lasting way. As the Muslim army marched with purpose toward Mount Uhud, the hypocrites who had joined their ranks suddenly turned back, pulling 300 men away at the most critical possible moment. He led that calculated withdrawal personally, and as he turned his back on the Prophet, he spoke words deliberately engineered to spread maximum fear and maximum doubt among the remaining soldiers. He suggested openly that the battle was already lost before it had truly begun, and that those who turned back with him were the ones displaying genuine wisdom and sound judgment. 300 men followed him away from Uhud that day, and that single act of cold betrayal weakened the Muslim army precisely when they needed every available man standing firmly beside them. The battle turned with devastating consequences. The Muslims suffered their most painful military setback, and the Prophet himself was wounded, while the hypocrites barely concealed their quiet and ugly satisfaction. In the grief-soaked aftermath of Uhud, the city of Medina mourned deeply. Women had lost husbands, children had lost fathers, and wounds far beyond the physical cut through every heart. And yet, even in that profound and heavy grief, the believers turned sincerely to Allah, held firmly to their Prophet, and rose again with even greater and more resolved determination. This remarkable resilience completely baffled the hypocrites, because they had calculated that enough sustained pressure would eventually shatter the believers. But the community kept returning to its foundation every single time. The leader of the hypocrites shifted his strategy once more. If open battlefield sabotage had failed to destroy them, then perhaps slow and deliberate social poison within Medina would prove far more effective. He began using the marketplaces, the tribal councils, and the informal gatherings of Medina as platforms to carefully inject doubt, arrogance, and dangerous division into the conversations flowing all around him. One of his most infamous weapons was a statement he delivered with devastating cynicism, twisting the language of generosity into a sharp instrument of pride and contempt aimed directly at the believers. He spoke openly, in the presence of those whose faith was still tender and untested, suggesting that the honorable would soon drive out the lowly ones from Medina entirely without mercy. By the honorable, he meant himself and those loyal to him, and by the lowly, he was directing his poisonous contempt toward the Prophet and the Muhajirun, who had migrated with nothing. This statement was not careless or accidental. It was a precisely calculated insult, wrapped in tribal language, designed to fracture the sacred bond between the Ansar and the Muhajirun at its most delicate point. When this reached the ears of the Prophet, the companions trembled with righteous anger. Some were ready to act immediately, but the Prophet responded with a wisdom flowing directly from above. The Prophet chose patience over punishment at that particular moment, and this deliberate and profound restraint was itself a leadership lesson the hypocrites had not anticipated and could not understand or counter. But those words had already traveled far. They had already landed in certain ears, stirred certain hearts, and the damage that subtle, poisonous speech causes is often far greater than any visible weapon. Not long after, during one of the military expeditions, an incident erupted, explosive, deliberately engineered, and threatening to tear the entire young Muslim community apart from its very foundation completely. A minor dispute broke out between a man from the Muhajirun and a man from the Ansar, a small but dangerous spark inside a dry and exhausted desert camp full of tired men. The leader of the hypocrites seized upon this dispute with the precision of a predator who had been waiting patiently in the shadows for exactly this kind of opportunity to finally present itself. He escalated the conflict with carefully chosen words, inflamed ancient tribal loyalties, reminded each side of their differences, and worked with deliberate intent to transform a small argument into communal catastrophe. He gathered his followers tightly around him and delivered words so dangerous, so deliberately divisive, and so precisely poisonous that they spread alarm immediately throughout the exhausted and stretched desert camp. The companions reported everything they had heard directly to the Prophet, and for the first time, some began genuinely asking whether the moment had arrived to deal with this threat decisively. Among those who heard the full and devastating report of what had been said was a young man whose heart burned with a righteous and unconditional love for the Prophet above everything. He came forward asking the Prophet for clear permission to act against this threat, and the answer he received would reveal something profound about justice, wisdom, and the patience of truth. But before that answer could fully settle and take root within the hearts of the believers, Allah Himself was already preparing a response far greater than any sword or army could ever deliver. His response would descend as revelation, as words destined to be recited until the very last day. And those eternal words were already moving toward the Prophet in that same burning desert. The desert air hung thick and heavy with unresolved tension as the Muslim army made its slow and burdened way back toward the familiar walls of blessed Medina city. The companions moved in a deep and weighted silence, each man carrying within him the unresolved burden of what had been said, heard, and not yet addressed or answered by anyone. The Prophet had not yet spoken publicly about the reported words, and that deliberate silence itself had become a kind of invisible pressure building steadily beneath everything surrounding them. Some companions wondered quietly and anxiously whether this would be the moment the community finally cracked, whether the poison had at last reached deep enough to cause irreversible and permanent damage. The leader of the hypocrites walked among them still, unhurried, visibly unbothered, wearing his practiced calm, as though nothing of any real consequence had occurred or been reported against him recently. He had spent many long years perfecting the dangerous art of saying the most destructive things, and then returning seamlessly to a posture of complete innocence before accountability could ever reach him. But this time, and every soul present could feel it, something was fundamentally and irreversibly different about the atmosphere gathering around them in that desert air that particular evening. The words had traveled too far, landed too loudly, and stirred too many hearts for this matter to simply dissolve quietly into the vast and indifferent silence of the surrounding desert. Then, in the manner that divine revelation always arrived, the Prophet received the words of Allah descending upon him with a weight that silenced absolutely everything around him completely. Surah Al-Munafiqun began to descend, a complete and devastating chapter of divine speech, each verse a surgical beam of divine light, cutting through every layer of darkness hypocrisy had constructed. The very first verse arrived with a force and a directness that the Arabic language itself seemed to strain and tremble to contain within the boundaries of its most powerful and precise words. Allah declared that when the hypocrites came to the Prophet, they testified with their tongues that he was the messenger of Allah, yet Allah bore witness that they were absolute liars. This was not merely an accusation. This was Allah himself testifying against them, confirming that even their most sacred spoken words had become instruments of calculated deception and spiritual corruption. The second verse continued the devastating exposure, revealing that the hypocrites had taken their very oaths as a protective shield, hiding behind the words of faith while actively working against everything faith required. They had weaponized the declaration of Islam itself, wearing it as a costume, while everything beneath that costume moved in a direction completely and deliberately opposite to all that Islam truly stood for. The third verse then struck at the deepest and most essential root of the matter. They had believed and then disbelieved. And so Allah had sealed their hearts completely away from all guidance. This sealing was not an arbitrary punishment imposed from outside. It was the natural and terrifying consequence of a soul choosing deception so completely and so persistently that it loses all capacity for truth. The fourth verse then painted a portrait so vivid, so precise and so recognizable that those hearing it in that desert must have felt the ground shifting beneath their very feet with absolute certainty. Allah described how their outward appearance would impress anyone who looked upon them. Their speech was eloquent, their bearing was confident, their presence was commanding and immediately convincing to those around them. Yet Allah described them as nothing more than propped-up hollow timber, beautiful in appearance, utterly empty within, and unable to distinguish a genuine call from the noise surrounding them on all sides. The fifth verse then delivered what may be the most chilling and sobering declaration in the entire surah, that when they were told to seek forgiveness, they turned away with visible arrogance and open contempt. The Prophet himself, the most beloved of all creation, the man whose intercession the entire creation will desperately seek on the day of judgment, could not reach a sealed and chosen heart. Allah stated clearly and without any softening that whether the Prophet sought forgiveness for them or chose not to, Allah would never forgive them, for Allah does not guide the corrupt and rebellious. These were not just words about one man in one desert. These were eternal divine principles being established about the nature of hypocrisy, the danger of a sealed heart, and the limits of human intercession. When the companions heard these verses recited for the first time, the silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of people whose souls had just been completely rearranged. The young man who had come to the Prophet asking for permission to act now understood something far deeper, that Allah had chosen to respond to this threat with revelation, not retaliation. And the leader of the hypocrites, when the news of this surah reached him, could not retreat into innocence this time, because the words of Allah do not negotiate and do not accept denial. His own son, a true and sincere believer who loved Islam with every fiber of his being, came to learn of his father's exposed words and felt the earth collapse beneath him with grief. This young man, whose faith was genuine and whose love for the Prophet was absolute, now stood at the most painful crossroads any human being could ever be forced to stand upon. His father was the most publicly exposed hypocrite in all of Medina, named not by men, but by Allah himself through revelation that would echo across all of time and eternity forever. He went to the Prophet, not to defend his father, not to deny the truth, but to make a request that revealed the extraordinary depth and purity of his own sincere believing heart. He asked the Prophet that if punishment were to come upon his father, he wished that it should come through his own hand and not through the hand of any other man. His reasoning was devastating in its sincerity. He could not bear the thought of spending the rest of his life looking into the eyes of the man who had killed his father with justified cause. The Prophet looked at this young man, this sincere, tortured, faithful young man, and responded with a gentleness and a wisdom that only prophethood could produce in that impossible and painful moment. No punishment would come through any human hand that day, but the exposure through divine revelation had already accomplished something far more lasting than any punishment delivered by any sword ever could. The leader of the hypocrites was now a man walking through Medina with his true face permanently and publicly displayed, not by rumor, not by accusation, but by the eternal words of Allah himself. And as the Muslim army finally entered the gates of Medina, carrying the weight of revelation and the memory of what the desert had just witnessed, nothing in that city would ever be quite the same again. The verses of Surah Al-Munafiqun had descended, but their full and devastating meaning and the lessons they carried for every generation of believers yet to come had only just truly begun to unfold completely. What would happen to this man now that Allah had removed every mask he had ever worn? And what would the community do with a truth this enormous and this permanently inescapable was yet to be fully revealed? The news traveled through Medina the way desert wind travels, invisibly at first, then suddenly everywhere, and by morning there was not a single household that had not heard what had descended. Allah had revealed Surah Al-Munafiqun, an entire chapter of his eternal book, and the name it pointed toward, though unspoken in the text, was known by every single person in the city. The leader of the hypocrites woke that morning into a Medina that had fundamentally and permanently changed around him, even though the streets, the palm trees and the buildings remained exactly as they had always been. He could still walk through the marketplace, but the eyes that once looked upon him with political deference now looked upon him with a knowing that no amount of eloquence could ever erase or soften. He could still enter the masjid, but the sacred space that revelation had filled now held within its very walls the divine words that had publicly and permanently dismantled his every carefully constructed deception. For years, he had controlled the narrative surrounding himself, but you cannot control a narrative when Allah himself has chosen to write the final and definitive version of your story for all eternity. His followers, those who had gathered around him, taken comfort in his presence, and drawn their social confidence from his perceived power, now found themselves standing on ground that had completely collapsed beneath them. Some among them began to feel the first tremors of genuine fear, not of the Prophet, not of the companions, but of something far greater and far more inescapable than any human authority could ever be. The surah had described them with such precision, such intimate and devastating accuracy, that some among the hypocrites began to wonder privately whether they had been individually and specifically observed by the divine gaze above them. That is the particular terror of being exposed by Allah. It is not the exposure of a crime that can be denied or a rumor that can be countered. It is the exposure of the soul itself. Meanwhile, the sincere believers of Medina were experiencing something entirely different. They were experiencing a confirmation so powerful and so reassuring that it deepened their faith to levels they had not previously known were reachable. Allah had not abandoned them to the slow poison working within their community. He had seen everything, he had recorded everything, and he had responded with the most powerful intervention imaginable from above. The companions who had spent months watching the hypocrites move freely among them, feeling the frustration of a threat they could sense but never fully expose, now felt that divine justice was never sleeping, even for a moment. The young man, the sincere son of the exposed leader, carried within himself a grief so layered and so complex that no simple word in any human language could ever come close to fully describing it. He loved his father with the natural and powerful love that exists between a son and the man who raised him. Yet he loved Allah and his messenger with a love that surpassed and transcended everything else. This was the most painful kind of test a believer can face, not the test of an external enemy, not the test of poverty or fear, but the test of love, pulling in two sacred and opposing directions simultaneously. He had already gone to the Prophet and made his extraordinary request that any consequence for his father should pass through his own hands, and the Prophet had responded with mercy and profound wisdom. The Prophet had chosen not to execute the leader of the hypocrites, a decision that some companions found difficult to fully understand in that moment of justified anger and righteous community protection. But the Prophet explained, with characteristic clarity and depth, that he did not want the people of Arabia to say that Muhammad killed his own companions, even those who were companions only in outward appearance. This was a protection not just of the individual, but of the integrity and the reputation of Islam itself, ensuring that mercy remained visible, even when judgment would have been entirely justified and completely deserved. The leader of the hypocrites lived on, but the life he lived after the revelation of Surah Al-Munafiqun was a fundamentally diminished and hollowed existence compared to everything he had once imagined for himself. The political influence he had craved evaporated steadily, not dramatically, not through any single visible confrontation, but through the quiet and inevitable erosion that comes when the truth about a person has been permanently and publicly established. People who had once sought his counsel now stepped slightly aside when he approached, not out of dramatic rejection, but out of the subtle and instinctive distance that human beings naturally place between themselves and a known deceiver. His words, which had once carried significant weight in the councils and gathering places of Medina, now landed differently, heard with the particular caution that people apply to someone whose true character has been fully and finally revealed. He continued to pray in the masjid, because to stop doing so would be to openly declare the disbelief that the revelation had already confirmed was living within his chest, all along without any mask remaining. And so he performed an extraordinary and tragic act. He continued performing the outward worship of a religion whose book had just publicly and permanently named the spiritual reality he had chosen to inhabit within himself. The companions watched all of this with a complex mixture of emotions: righteous firmness about the truth, genuine concern for the community's continued protection, and something resembling sorrow for what a human soul could choose to become. Because hypocrisy is not born fully formed, it grows from choices, each one slightly darker than the last, and somewhere along the journey of this man's life, a door had been permanently and fatally closed within him. The verses of Surah Al-Munafiqun also delivered a powerful warning to the sincere believers, a warning that the emotional fallout of this entire episode was designed by Allah to permanently embed within every faithful heart forever. Allah warned the believers through this surah not to allow their wealth, their children, or their worldly affairs to distract them from the remembrance of Allah. For those who are distracted in that way are among the true losers. This warning was not directed at the hypocrites alone. It was directed at every sincere believer who witnessed these events, reminding them that the beginning of the path towards spiritual destruction begins with distraction from the remembrance of Allah. The believers of Medina absorbed this lesson not as an abstract theological principle, but as a living, breathing, historically grounded warning that they had watched play out in devastating detail right before their eyes. They had seen with their own eyes what a human being becomes when worldly ambition, in this case the desire for political power and status, is placed above the truth that Allah has sent through His messenger. The surah then urged the believers with a particular urgency to spend from what Allah has provided before death arrives, because at that moment of final departure, all regret and all desire to return will be too permanently and completely late. This urgency carried a particular emotional weight in Medina at that moment, because everyone in the city had recently confronted the reality of death, the fragility of life, and the terrifying nearness of the final moment of accountability. The leader of the hypocrites would eventually die, as every soul must die. And when that moment arrived, it would carry with it a weight and a consequence that the entire Muslim community would be forced to witness and navigate together. That moment of his death would produce one of the most discussed, most debated, and most profoundly instructive events in the entire early history of Islam. One that even the companions found difficult to fully understand at first. It would involve the Prophet making a decision that surprised everyone, prompted a direct response from Allah through revelation, and permanently established one of the clearest boundaries in all of Islamic jurisprudence and prophetic conduct. And the full meaning of everything this man's life had represented, every warning, every lesson, and every divine principle his story was designed to permanently establish, was about to be delivered in its most complete and lasting form. When the leader of the hypocrites finally died, his son, that sincere and faithful young believer, came to the Prophet and made a request that stunned those standing nearby with its unexpected and disarming nature. He asked the Prophet to give him his blessed shirt so that his father could be shrouded and buried within it, and the Prophet, in his incomprehensible mercy and wisdom, agreed and gave it without hesitation. He then asked the Prophet to pray the funeral prayer over his father, and the Prophet stood and prepared to do so, moving forward with a mercy that no purely human calculation could have produced or predicted. At that precise moment, as the Prophet prepared to pray, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh stepped forward with the burning urgency of a man who could not allow what he was witnessing to proceed without a word. He reminded the Prophet of everything this man had done, the betrayal at Uhud, the poisonous words, the years of damage inflicted upon the community from within, asking how a prayer could be offered over such a man. The Prophet gently acknowledged the concern, but proceeded, and the funeral prayer was offered. And shortly thereafter, Allah revealed verses that would make this the last such prayer ever to be offered over a hypocrite. Allah revealed that the Prophet should never pray the funeral prayer over any of them, nor stand at their graves, for they had rejected Allah and His Messenger and died while they were defiantly and completely corrupt. This was not a rebuke of the Prophet, it was a mercy to him, a protection of his blessed time, his sacred presence, and a permanent establishment of a divine boundary that would govern the community forever going forward. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu later reflected on this moment with a profound and characteristic honesty, noting that his own understanding had been correct in its instinct, but limited in its knowledge of what Allah would ultimately decide and establish. This entire sequence of events, from the early ambitions of one man, to the descent of an entire surah of the Quran, contains within it more lessons for the living than most people will ever pause long enough to fully absorb. The first and perhaps most unsettling lesson is this, that hypocrisy does not announce itself with obvious and visible warning signs that allow everyone around it to immediately and clearly identify what they are looking at. It walks in the masjid. It speaks in the language of faith. It knows the right words and the right gestures, and it sits comfortably within the most sacred circles of the believing community without triggering immediate alarm. The only protection against it, the only shield that Allah has given us, is the sincerity of our own hearts, the consistency of our own private worship, and the honest and fearless examination of our own intentions before Allah. Because the most dangerous form of hypocrisy that any of us will ever face is not the hypocrisy we observe in others. It is the subtle and creeping hypocrisy that can begin to take root within our own souls when we are not watching carefully. The companions, radiallahu anhum, those greatest of all human generations, used to fear hypocrisy for themselves more than they feared almost any other spiritual disease, because they understood its nature with a depth that most of us have not yet reached. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu would ask Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman radiallahu anhu, the companion whom the Prophet had entrusted with the names of the hypocrites, whether he, Umar, was among those names. Such was his fear. That level of honest and fearless self-examination, that willingness to ask the most uncomfortable questions about your own spiritual reality, is itself one of the greatest signs of a genuinely sound and living heart before Allah. The second lesson that this story permanently establishes is that worldly ambition, when it is allowed to grow without the restraint of taqwa and sincere faith, will eventually consume everything beautiful within a human soul completely. This man had gifts, genuine gifts of leadership, eloquence, and political intelligence, but he chose to place those gifts entirely in the service of his own ego rather than in the service of the truth that had arrived before him. And so those very gifts became his destruction. His eloquence made his deception more effective. His intelligence made his manipulation more dangerous. And his leadership gathered around him people who were pulled away from the straight path because of him. Allah does not waste any human capacity, but He does allow human beings to choose how those capacities are used. And that choice, made repeatedly and consistently over a lifetime, becomes the architecture of a person's eternal destiny. The third lesson, and perhaps the one most urgently needed in our own time, is that the Muslim community has always had within it those who wear Islam as a costume rather than carrying it as a conviction deep within. This is not a new problem, it is not a modern crisis, and it is not evidence that something has gone fundamentally wrong with the faith itself. It is a reality that Allah warned about in the Quran from the very beginning. The existence of hypocrisy within the community does not weaken the truth of Islam. It actually confirms the truth of Islam, because Allah told us explicitly that this would exist and showed us through revelation exactly what it looks like from the inside. Today, in the cities of the West, in the communities of South Asia, in the Muslim households of Africa and beyond, the question that Surah Al-Munafiqun asks of every single one of us remains exactly as sharp and as urgent as it ever was. When you enter the masjid, when you raise your hands in prayer, when you speak about Islam in public, is what is visible on the outside a true and honest reflection of what is actually alive and moving within your heart? That question is not an accusation. It is a divine invitation, an invitation from Allah to examine the space between what we show the world and what we carry in the private and unseen chambers of our own souls before Him. The Prophet described 3 signs of the hypocrite in an authentic hadith preserved in both Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. When he speaks, he lies. When he makes a promise, he breaks it. and when he is trusted, he betrays completely. These are not merely the signs of a religious hypocrite. They are the signs of a soul that has disconnected its private reality from its public presentation. And that disconnection, if left unchecked, will grow until it consumes everything within. The son of the leader of the hypocrites stands as one of the most quietly powerful figures in this entire story. A young man who chose truth over blood, chose faith over family loyalty, and chose Allah over everything else. His story reminds us that where a person comes from does not determine where a person is going. That the child of the most notorious hypocrite in Islamic history became a man whose sincerity and faith are remembered with honor across all generations. No matter what surrounds you, no matter what family you were born into, what community raised you, or what social pressures are pulling at you from every direction, the door to sincere faith remains open to every heart that genuinely chooses to walk through it. Surah Al-Munafiqun ends with a call so direct, so urgent, and so personal that it feels as though Allah is speaking it specifically and individually into the ear of every single person who will ever recite those final verses aloud. Allah calls the believers to spend from what He has provided before death arrives. For when death arrives, a person will cry out, asking for just a little more time, just a little more opportunity, just one more chance to do what was left undone. But that cry will receive no answer, because the moment of return has no extension, the appointment of death has no negotiation, and the soul that departs with its account incomplete cannot send back any message to correct what it left behind. The ancient city of Medina, the burning desert roads, the political ambitions of one calculating man, and the descent of divine revelation onto the heart of the most beloved of all prophets, all of it was recorded and preserved for us. It was preserved so that we, living in different cities, wearing different clothes, speaking different languages, facing different pressures, might look into the mirror of this story and see with total clarity the condition of our own hearts before Allah. The question that this story leaves resting in the chest of every honest person who has heard it is not about Abdullah Ibn Ubayy. It was never truly about him alone at all. The question is about you, about the space between your public face and your private heart, about whether what you show to the world is what you would be willing to show to Allah in this very moment. May Allah protect every heart in this ummah from the disease of hypocrisy, purify our intentions, make our private reality more beautiful than our public presentation, and gather us on the day of judgment among the truthful and the sincere forever.